Okay, we're just going to jump right into the code. One thing you're going to want to be somewhat familiar with is ES6 or ECMAScript 6 or ECMAScript 2015. It's a slightly newer version of JavaScript. If you're used to using things like var, we're going to be replacing that with some ES6 stuff like const and let. There are some videos here on Scrimba that should be able to help you learn that if you're not familiar with it. And you'll want to do that before you move too far along in React because we'll be using a lot of ES6 in React. One of the things we'll be using really often, in fact, in every React file we create, is the import statement. And so I'm going to import React from React, and you can see over here on the left I have React and ReactDom dependencies included in this project. So I'm actually also going to import ReactDom from ReactDom. And the last thing I'm going to do is use ReactDom's render method to render something to our screen. Let's stop and explain this a little bit here. I'll get to why we're importing React in a second, but for now, I need to import ReactDom so that I can use it in my line 4 code here, where I use the render method. And what this is going to do is it's going to take two arguments. One is going to be what do I want to render? I'm doing this in pseudocode, obviously, so that it's clear that this is not the right syntax. And the second parameter is where do I want to render it? ReactDom.render makes the second one really easy. Remember, everything is going to have to tie back to an HTML page of some sort. The JavaScript we are going to continue to write is simply going to be compiled down to or turned into elements on a page. And so you can think of it as being inserted into an HTML page of sorts. So let's go over to index.html really quick. You'll see everything in a basic HTML page is here, including a link tag and a script. Don't worry about the fact that this is slightly different right now. It will still connect correctly to our index.js. One thing I want to point your attention to, though, is this div right here with the ID of root. Right in between the opening and closing div tags is where React is going to be sticking everything that we create. You can think of this as a container for our entire application. So back in our index.js, this where do I want to render it needs to point to the div with the ID of root. And the way that I can do that is using a vanilla JavaScript document.getElementById root. This way, render looks at the first parameter, which I haven't filled out yet, that says what do I want to render, and it will stick it inside of the div with the ID of root. Now let's look at this first part. What do I want to render? Let's get rid of this placeholder. And let's just start with a simple h1. And of course, we have to say hello world. I'm going to refresh the browser over here and notice that we actually get an h1 with a hello world in there. Now, the astute of you might have said, wait a second, why are you putting an HTML element in the middle of your JavaScript parameter? That's an obvious syntax error. JavaScript is going to think that that is a less than symbol and that this is a greater than symbol and not know that this is an HTML element. Well, fortunately for us, the people that created React created a little pseudo language, you could call it, called JSX. And JSX is very much like a JavaScript rendition or version of HTML. In fact, we're going to see that most of JSX looks almost identical to HTML, with a few slight differences that we'll talk about along the way. There's a lot happening under the hood with React, where everything is getting compiled down to a plain JavaScript version of itself. But for us, we can just pretend that this will work just fine. And it turns out this is why we need to import React from React, because the React library is the one that will enable JSX to work the way it's supposed to work. In fact, you can see that if I remove the import React line and try to save it and refresh the browser, it tells me that React is not defined. Even though I'm not explicitly using React anywhere in my code here, under the hood, it's getting used to interpret the JSX. Another point I want to touch on really quick is also dealing with JSX. It's important to note that I can't render two JSX elements next to each other. For example, if I wanted an H1 and a paragraph, you can see that it's already not liking what I'm doing. And if I were to save the page, it tells me that you can't have two adjacent JSX elements, but instead they have to be wrapped in something so that it counts as just one element with two elements inside. For example, I might choose to wrap this in a div. And I need to put my React in back. And there we go. Using JSX can take a little bit of getting used to, but it's much better and nicer after you get used to it than doing it the old way where you'd have to say things like var my new paragraph equals document dot create element paragraph and add some inner HTML. And then take that paragraph and append it to a parent. That was very imperative, whereas now we're going to be doing things much more declaratively. I also want to interject right here that you should remember that the benefit of Scrimba is that you can pause this screencast and play with this code. So please take some time to do that, not just at the end, but also throughout the entire screencast. We're also going to be including entire screencasts that are dedicated to you doing exercises, as mentioned in the first video. So take some time, play with this, study it up, and get ready for the upcoming exercise.